Hello, testing, testing. That sounds pretty good. So, hello to third year psychology students. Great to see you and meet you. My name is James Neal and I'm the unit convener for Survey Research and Design in Psychology. So this is your third year Research Methods and Statistics unit. So lecture one. First of all, I should acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we meet, the Ngunnawal people, and pay respect to past, present and future elders. And I'd also like to pay respect to those of you from all ethnicities. So today, like most units, I'll give you an overview of the unit itself and what you're in for, what you're going to learn about, where the challenges might be, and things like that. And then in the second part, we'll do a lecture on survey design to get you rolling with the topic. So feel free to ask questions as I go. Hopefully many of your questions I'll anticipate and answer, but at the same time don't hesitate to ask. As you've probably worked out, the university has a new learning management system, so we're now onto Canvas and off Moodle. You've had 2 years of getting used to Moodle, so it'll be a little bit of a learning experience for you, and as you'll find, it's a learning experience for the staff. If you find broken links, things that don't seem to mesh like you would think they should, please let me know. I'm still finding things, but I think mostly we're up and running with this unit. So I'll give you a little bit of a tour then of the Canvas site, since that's probably going to be your starting place. Let me put it into student view and then it should look exactly like what you're going to see. Okay, so I'm assuming that when you jump onto Canvas, this is pretty much what you'll see. In a moment, I'll go through some key things in the unit outline, which for most people is the assessment. That's the number one thing you'd like to know about. I'm the unit convener, so I'm the lecturer and tutor. So you've only got the one person to deal with, for better or worse, but hopefully that means that there's good consistency across what I might say in lectures, what we do in tutes, what's involved in the assessment, etc. In terms of the timetabling, there is a schedule here which is probably the best single page in terms of what's happening in what weeks. And I will go into that in a little bit more detail, but that's probably your single best page to map out lectures, tutes and the quizzes, which are closely aligned to the lecture and reading content. Oops. If you're overwhelmed by it all, then you can click on that Getting Started tab and it just gives you a couple of things or a couple of suggestions for getting started. There's not a huge amount of content that I'll put onto Canvas, but the quizzes are there, the assessment drop boxes are there, announcements and discussions are there. So those aspects are not that different to Moodle. Most of the content, however, like the lecture notes, the tutorial notes, and additional explanatory information, you'll find on the Wikiversity website, which is much like Wikipedia. For those of you who have already done motivation and emotion with me, you'll already be very familiar with Wikiversity. So all of the general material you'll find there. So all of last year's materials are up there, and gradually I will update them each week for the lectures. But really, the whole unit materials is up there for you to look at. I will post a message, an announcement, once the lecture slides are updated each week. But otherwise, everything on there should be current. And if you do want to look ahead or at least see what's coming, then that would be the place to go. In terms of the assessment that's up there, let me click on this assessment tab. Okay. So there are 3 parts to the assessment. There's no final exam, so that's replaced by quizzes. And there are 9 lecture topics plus a summary lecture. So there is 1 quiz per lecture topic. Okay, worth 5%. Is that a question or just a... Okay, no worries. So you've got 9 quizzes worth 5% each. The quizzes all close at the end of semester. So they close on the Monday of week 14, week 13 being the last week. So it's up to you how you want to tackle them. Some people will follow the lectures weekly, and I would suggest not doing the quiz until you've at least heard the lecture and probably done a little bit of reading. But the quizzes are most closely attached to the lecture. So if there's only one thing you're going to do to study for your quizzes, either come to the lecture or listen to the recording and then sit down and do the quiz. If there's things you didn't quite get, then make sure you do some reading then before you sit the quiz. Others will leave it towards the end and just basically sit something like a big final exam, maybe on the last weekend after classes are finished. So the crammers will take that approach. I don't really mind. It's up to you. That's why it's left that way. So you can pick your method. There's 10 questions per quiz, drawn randomly from a larger test bank. Mostly there's a 10-minute time limit, but for some of the quizzes there's 15 or 20 minutes where they're a bit more involved. The earlier quizzes are a bit easier, so the average on the early quizzes is probably 8 or 9 out of 10. Once we get to some of the multivariate statistics, they get harder, and the average on those ones is more like 6 out of 10. But overall, people get the average is about 70% probably for the quizzes. They are open book, but they're not open person. You are meant to sit them independently. And there's probably more data, more footprint you leave online than you realise. So there's about half a dozen people each year who end up getting referred for potential quiz plagiarism. So just bear that in mind. I probably know more about what you're doing online than you'd like to think. So that's your sort of bread and butter, checking your general knowledge about the topics we're covering. Then there's a data collection and entry exercise. This is the early kind of assessment exercise. We're meant to give you something to do in the first few weeks to check that you're alive and breathing and engaged, and get you some sort of feedback about your engagement. So this has 2 parts, the electronic data submission part and then the hand-in of the hard copy surveys. So the first thing that you need to make sure you get done is by the beginning of week 4, Monday 9 a.m. week 4, which is a bit less than 3 weeks' time, you need to have, I'll explain this in a bit more detail in a moment, but essentially downloaded and printed out a survey that I'll give you. You fill out one of them yourself, and then following the administration guidelines, go onto campus and collect 4 surveys from people that you approach using the methods described in the guidelines. So you'll then have 5 surveys completed. You'll download a template, an SPSS data entry template, and enter those 5 cases worth of data. Save that file, and then what you upload is your SPSS file with that data. Then what I'll do is download all of that data and merge it into one large data file. So if we've got roughly 120 of you enrolled, 5 cases each, I will then give back to you a data file with 600 cases in it. And that data file is what you'll use to analyse for the lab report that we do later. After you've submitted your electronic data, you then need to submit the hard copy surveys with a cover sheet so that I can cross-check the electronic data with the hard copy surveys. Some people might be doing it from home, so there's an extra two weeks to get your hard copies to me. So they're due by Monday of week 6. You can hand them to me in a lecture, you can hand them to me in a tutorial, or you can put them into my Pigeonhole up on Building 12, Level D. The key thing is there's no marks at all unless you can produce the electronic data and the hard copy data on time. If one of those is missing, no marks. So basically there's only marks for valid, verifiable, on-time data. Now, in a moment I'll tell you a bit more about that because it's the first thing to do. And then the third component of the assessment is an APA-style lab report. Doesn't have the word count there. I think it's 2,600 words, something like that. And that's due at the end of semester. So Monday morning of week 13. Just for convenience, everything's due Monday 9 a.m. So at least those people who are working have the weekend to work on it. And the lab report is really going to test your lab knowledge. So the skills that I'll teach you, you'll get the theoretical knowledge in lectures, but then you'll get the hands-on practical doing multiple linear regression and factor analysis. We'll be doing that in the lab. So the lab report will be you demonstrating your ability to use those techniques using the class collected data file. There's more data than you can possibly analyse in terms of numbers of variables. So you'll also need to come up with your own research question and hypotheses and interrogate the data file to answer that set of questions. So I'm not going to give you the question. Almost certainly everybody will end up with a slightly different lab report. There'll be some parallels, but you'll all treat the data slightly differently, make some different decisions along the way, and be targeting different variables. Now, are there any, I'm going to tell you more about the data collection stuff, but are there any general questions about the assessment?
The things you can do, obviously, with that data, you go in and then get back to it. Is there anything, can we start the lab report before that or not really?
Okay, that's a good question. Can you start the lab report? What can you do to get going? Basically, from week 6, when I give you the data set back, you can then be actively cleaning the data, screening it, and starting on your factor analysis. Between now and week 6, what you can be doing is, well, collecting your own data and entering it. That's part of it. But I'll give you a bit more background about the variables involved, so you can be doing some literature review around those variables. So probably what I could do actually is bring up the survey and just give you a quick look at what's involved. But these aren't the only topics, but there's questions about time management, and there's questions about something called time perspective, you'll need to do a factor analysis on one of those two topics. So, yeah, as of today, you could start doing that. And actually, if we look at see here, there's a link to the reading list. If you go into the reading list, okay, it might not work in student mode. I'm assuming this works in student mode, so if it doesn't, tell me. It doesn't. Okay, so you don't get this. Okay, I'll follow that up. I'll just make a quick note to get the reading list active. Okay, I'll get that active, and once it's active, I'll send an announcement. And once you get access, you'll see that the readings are listed in categories, and the last two categories, if we can get down to them, there's a category here for time management. So there's a few articles that you could download and start getting familiar with time management, and there's a few articles here on time perspective. And you're not restricted to those, but they are starting points for your thinking. So each of you will need to pick either time management or time perspective for the factor analysis in the lab report, and that would be the starting point. Yeah. Oh, so it does come up. Okay. Okay. All right. That's good. Thank you. So you're definitely in there and can see. Okay. All right. Great. So since we are there, well, let me go back to textbooks actually. So the reading list just contains copyright restricted readings associated with each of the topics. There are also links to the textbooks. Now, I haven't prescribed, there should be more than one textbook. I haven't prescribed set textbooks. Most of you, but what I have referred to is the books that most of you have got from experimental, which are the Howitt and Kramer Intro to Stats and Psychology, and then their SPSS, Intro to SPSS or something. So I've cited those in the lectures, and I've given readings, say, on the schedule. So these chapter numbers refer to the Howitt and Kramer Intro to Stats in Psych. However, I've also listed additional readings which are there on the reading list or are freely available online. So the place to find, if you like, the definitive set of readings for a lecture is to go into the lecture from here or from the schedule here. If we go to lecture 1. So there's one Wikiversity page per lecture. It should say roughly what we're going to cover, and it should have a list of readings. So some of the readings are just online. If we click on that link, it should just be a web page. A reading like this, Fowler, is found in the eReserve survey design folder. I think they still call it. Yeah, it might be renamed. So there's no direct link there. You would go back here and look in, this is on the reading list tab, look in survey research and design. Whoop. little tricky to scroll through, isn't it? Okay, so there's the Fowler reading here, and there's the Nardi reading, which you'll see down here. There's the Howitt and Kramer chapters, etc. Now you might go, whoa, okay, that's a whole lot of reading. In third year, I kind of treat you a bit more like a postgraduate student, which is, I wouldn't expect anyone to read all of those word for word, but what I would expect you to do is say, what are we trying to learn about here? And these are actually the readings for the first 2 weeks. Well, we're trying to read about what are surveys, how do we design surveys, how do we write good survey questions. And so you need to interrogate those readings sufficiently to supplement what I've covered in lectures to go, okay, I think I've got the idea about, what a good survey looks like, what are good and bad survey questions, things like that. I can guarantee you there are not quiz questions that say, what did Fowler say on page 99 about XYZ theory, if I haven't made clear mention of it in the lecture. So the lectures I really see as highlighting what I consider to be the accessible kind of concepts. Okay, so readings, textbooks. So it's up to you which textbooks you want to buy. I have listed on the readings tab. If we go back to from the Wikiversity homepage, there is a tab called Readings here under Content, and if you go to the textbook link, you'll see, I suggest you do have at least one applied statistics textbook, and it needs to cover correlations, multiple linear regression, and factor analysis. So there are some alternative texts. Any textbook that covers those things would be sufficient. And I actually suggest it's a good idea to have more than one textbook, because sometimes it helps to look at the same topic in 2 or 3 different textbooks and look over each of them rather than just rely on one textbook. But that's also why I will give you online readings, and some of them are just scans of chapters from other textbooks. The other type of book you should have is some sort of SPSS how-to manual or an SPSS cookbook. Howitt and Kramer, if you've got it, that's great. But you can also borrow from the library something like Allen and Bennett. A lot of students like the Pallant book, the SPSS Survival Manual. So if you want to buy a second SPSS cookbook, then that can be handy as well. And these days you probably don't need your own APA style guide, but if you're keen on psychology, you can go to the bookshop and buy the full APA style manual for about $50. But otherwise there are so many online versions that describe the main principles, then they would be fine as well. Okay, so let me just say a little bit about tutorials. You need to check what tutorial stream you're enrolled in. All tutorials are on Wednesday, so there's classes at 9:30, 12 and 2:30 in 12B16, the Psych Computer Lab, and then there's an evening online class at 6 p.m. Now you'll see here there's really only 4 2-hour tutorials where I'm going to teach you new information. I'm going to teach you all the skills that you need to be able to do the lab report in those 8 hours. And if there's one part of the course that I guess I would emphasise, and say, if you want to pass or do well, get yourself to those 8 hours worth of tutorials. You can listen to these lectures online. You haven't missed out on much. I will record the virtual tutorial, plus, a bit like Janie, you've all had Janie in first and second year, plus I've made screencast recordings of each little segment. But the value of being in the lab is that it's more interactive. I can look over your shoulder and help you out, and there's lots of little sort of tips and nuances and so on that you'll get. So it is a flexible unit. You don't have to turn up. You can do everything online. But I guess if you want to get best value, I would try and prioritise getting to your Wednesday tutorial. There's only 4, and they're basically then fortnightly. You'll either come weeks 1, 3, 5, and 9, or you'll be coming 2, 4, 6, 10. If you can't make the tutorial that you're booked into, I'd prefer you do come, but if you can't make it, try and come to another time, all right? If you've got your own laptop, we'll certainly fit you in. I'm not going to kick you out. At worst case is you just don't get a computer, because a computer will go to those in the booked class, but even if you can turn up, that will still be valuable. And to be honest, look, there's 120 of you enrolled, there's 30 or 40 of you here. There's always going to be people who don't show, so chances are there are free seats for those who are keen virtually at any time. On top of that, the half hour before every shoot and the half hour after every shoot, I'll be in the lab. So if you're struggling, you've got questions, or you want to come in and work on your data entry or your lab report, come early to class or stay after class, and I'll be in the lab there to give you a hand. So I've purposely not booked the labs back to back. I've left gaps so that there's some downtime in the lab for your questions. Those times will get busier and busier towards the end of the semester, and I'll be very available early in semester. So if you can get on top of things and get going, you'll get more of my time to help you out. And then I think we run into Anzac Day. I think it's week 11, which is a Wednesday. So we miss week 11 for labs, but in week 12 on the Wednesday, I'll be in the lab from 9 to 5. This is the lab report workshop down here, and that's a chance for you to come in and work on your lab report, and I'll be around to help troubleshoot. So you can probably get a lot more done, because you sort of run into all sorts of little road bumps as you go, if you come and work in the lab, because I can help to sort of unstick you and keep you moving, or somebody sitting next to you can probably help you out. So that would be the Wednesday of week 12, with the lab report due on Monday of week 13. So that's about 4 or 5 days before the lab report is due. So that's also a good day to mark out in your diary as a good one to come in and work on the lab report. Okay, everything I just said there about times and rooms and stuff, that's all on the bottom of this schedule. Okay, drop-in tutorials, etc. And I'll probably send an announcement that says all of that as well. All right, any questions about Tute's assessment? I'll do a little bit more on the data collection, lectures. No? Okay, so that you can get started on the data collection, probably the easiest thing to do is click on data submission on your Canvas page. And if we go to this link on data entry guidelines, Okay, the link I really wanted, maybe I need to put it up there, is just one step higher. So the starting page for this is data collection and entry. This tells you what you'll need to do. So step 1, collect 5 cases of survey data by following the survey admin guidelines, which we'll have a look at. Step 2, enter the data following the data entry guidelines. Step 3, submit the electronic data by the beginning of week 4, and then submit the hard copy data with a cover sheet, all stapled together by week 5. Okay, so the survey admin guidelines, print off 5 copies of the TSQ FUS1 survey. Now, I thought I just opened that link. Here we are. So here's the survey. It's a PDF file that we can click on. See if we can download it. Okay, so now we're into the PDF file. There's a cover sheet. Okay, it's the same survey as last year. Looks like I need to update the date, but otherwise we will keep it the same. So read the instructions. The idea is you fill out one yourself so that you're familiar with the survey. There's some background information, demographic type information on the first page. Then there's a few multi-item scales about different psychological variables. So there's a perceived stress scale, and if you want to, your question about can you do some work, you could look up the article that it's based on, and if you wanted to use stress as a variable later in the semester, then you might do some more reading about that. There's the time perspective inventory from Zimbardo. And that goes on to the next page. And then there's some questions about time management. Okay, so it's a 4-page survey. It can be single-sided or double-sided. That doesn't really matter. So back on these survey... Oh, sorry, I'll take that back. It says it needs to be single-sided. Oh, and the reason it needs to be single-sided is that people should have the opportunity to take off the cover page as evidence of their participation, and it's got contact numbers if they wanted to follow somebody up. So at least the first page needs to be single-sided. The rest of it can be single or double-sided. You should staple through the top left corner to keep the pages together. Complete one survey yourself. Collect 4 other cases of real survey data using, and this is our first technical term, using convenient sampling with systematic selection. Now what this means is you don't just go to 4 of your friends and say, hey, fill this out, I've got to do it for a class, because there's some bias in that. We're going to get a whole sample full of friends of psychology students, and we don't want that. What we want is a sample that is as representative of the general UC student population as possible. It's helpful to have some sort of clipboard or something for people to lean on, and we want you to go out onto the main concourse area during daylight hours. So we don't want you jumping out from behind pillars on people at night, getting them to do a survey. You can either go into the student refectory area or the general concourse hub area, or you could approach people coming out of the library, for example. But we don't want you scurrying off into student dorms and things like that. In order for it to be systematic, it's not you waiting until somebody you kind of feel attracted to walks out of the library and then approaching them. You need to be fair and equitable. So you might say, I'm going to pick every 7th person who comes out of that door. So you wait 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and then you walk up to that person and you introduce yourself and what you're doing. So, hi, my name's James. I'm a student in 3rd year psychology. We're conducting a survey today as part of a class exercise. Would you be prepared to complete this survey? It will take about 10 to 15 minutes. And if they say no, you say, thanks very much, have a nice day. And if they say yes, then you hand them the clipboard and a pen and let them fill it out. You don't need to be looking over their shoulder or anything like that. And while they're filling it out, you could then go, okay, the next 7th person out of the doorway I'm going to approach. So you could probably get it done in half an hour by having several people fill it out simultaneously. It does also say here to check that the person's a current UC student, so they're not a staff member or not just a visitor, because we are trying to study the student cohort. Did you have a question?
No.
Okay.
It was in regards to, say we wanted to make it a bit more generalised.
Yes.
Select more, having more surveys or no?
Oh, as in collect more data. I mean, there's nothing to stop you if you wanted to collect more data. We will include it, and you can enter more people onto the data file. But it's a little bit of many hands make light work. We're going to end up with a pretty large sample size just by everybody collecting 5 cases each.
Sorry, I thought it was we collect 5 surveys each and then we could run our own.
Yes.
5 surveys or something.
Yeah. No, that's okay. And in other classes, you often do something like that. But yeah, your 5 plus your 5 plus your 5, we're going to end up with plenty of data. Yeah. Okay. To help you write your method, you would record or make a note of how many refusals you had. So mostly you'll find that people tend to say yes. If you approach them with a smile in a sort of friendly, confident way, most people will go, yeah, okay. And some people will go, oh no, I'm busy or I don't want to. So mostly you'll find you should get sort of 70%, 80% type compliance based on past experience. Some people get 100% and some people less so, and I think that's then to do with your manner in how you approach people. That's just for you gives you something to write about in your procedure when you write up your report. We won't have that data for everyone, but you can write about it for your experience. Encourage them to read the instructions. Now, I know a lot of people, the first thing they do when they get a survey is just turn over the instructions, but all you can do is direct them to it and encourage them. And if they've got any questions to ask you, when they've finished, without sort of reading every single response, just flick over the pages just to check that they seem to have done everything, because sometimes people miss the last page, for example, either on purpose or not, and that way you could just say to them, oh, do you mind completing the last page? And they might go, whoops, sorry, didn't see it, and they'll finish it off. Of course, if they get halfway through it and they go, oh, don't want to do it, that's their prerogative. You don't have to get 4 complete surveys. Even the fact that you've got half a survey, that's okay. You could enter that. But if you want complete data, you could have a spare 1 or 2 and get 5 full cases. All I really want are 5 attempts, you plus 4, 5 attempts at collecting at least some data. Okay, and then what I'm going to do in the first lab is I'll show you how to download the data entry template and how to go about entering the data. It is fairly straightforward, so if you don't want to wait for it, just follow these guidelines here. There's the data entry template. a .sav file. You rename the file with your student name. You do need to number each of your surveys, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and enter that number into the data file so that we can match each hard copy with each line in the data file. And then what you're going to be uploading to Moodle is a data file, your student number.sav with 5 full cases. Now there's no extensions for this. It's basically you either get the data in and it's included in the class data file or you don't. It's only worth 10%, so it's basically 5% for the electronic stuff, 5% for the hard copy. Given that I'm going to be handling 600 surveys, there's some maybe pedantic but particular guidelines about how you enter the data and how you present the hard copy surveys so that it's relatively quick and easy for me to look at the data file, look at your hard copy and verify it. Anything that takes me more time because you stapled it on the other side or whatever and I've got to pull it apart, that's like, you know, a mark off. So 70 or 80% of you will probably get 10 out of 10, and then there's a few people who don't follow all the guidelines and will get a few marks off. And a few will miss the boat and get 0. Okay, so are there any other questions about that? So after this lecture, you could print them off and get going if you would like to. All right. I haven't actually looked at the unit outline, but I think I've covered the key things. So I'd encourage you to read that. What I'll do now is go to lecture 1. I guess what I didn't do is what topics are we covering. So before I launch into lecture 1, the lectures and shoots are loosely divided into 5 modules. So module 1, this week and next week, is really about what is survey research, how does it differ from experimental research, what are surveys, why do we use them, what are their advantages and disadvantages, what types of research can we do with surveys. That's today. Next week gets into the nitty-gritty of how to make a survey, what sort of questions can we have, what sort of response options can we have in a survey, what are some good ideas about structure and flow to create a good survey. Then module 2, we cover some basic territory that should be to some extent review, but it's important building blocks for what we then do next, which scales up pretty quickly. So lecture 3, descriptives and graphing, is dealing with single variables. What sort of descriptive stats can we use and what kind of graphs can we use to visualise that data? Then lecture 4, correlations, looking now at 2 variables, so bivariate relationships. How do we visualise the relationship between 2 variables? And what statistics can we use to analyse whether they're related or not, looking at non-parametric and parametric statistics. Then we go into multivariate analyses that are correlational in nature. So what you would have done with Janie in experimental psych was look at experimental design, and then you looked at t-tests and ANOVAs, basically. What we're doing in this unit now is looking at survey research design, and then we're looking at correlations. So once we get more than 2 variables, we've now got multivariate analyses. So how do we look at the correlations between 3 or more things? So first up, we'll do factor analysis, which is where we take lots of variables, 50, 100 different questions on a questionnaire, and we find the clusters or the factors, so the sets of variables that all correlate together. So if you think of a personality factor inventory with 50 questions, there's probably 10 questions about extroversion, 10 questions about conscientiousness, 10 questions about agreeableness, etc. So it's the mathematics of working out which sets of variables belong together. That's probably the part that will explode your brain the most. So if you get through that, then you're kind of over the hump in terms of the trickiest part of the unit. Lecture 6, psychometrics. That's a look at reliability, validity, creating composite scores, and that basically follows after factor analysis. Once you've worked out what your factors are, how do you then look at how good each of those measures is of a target construct? Lecture 7 and Lecture 8 then are on multiple linear regression. So you may recall that regression is where you use one variable to predict another variable. With multiple linear regression, we use several predictors of one outcome. I'll talk a bit more about that in shoots, but for the lab report, you need to do one factor analysis and one multiple linear regression. And so you'll need to identify 3 things. It might be a very simple one, might be gender, age and stress, and you use that to predict somebody's physical health, something like that. Lecture 9 will be the last bit of new information, statistical power and effect sizes, and then we'll do a wrap-up. Okay, so having said all of that, let's have a look at this intro to survey research. So I'll direct you to the readings. The scientific paradigm, we'll touch on that. What types of research and are there? Experimental, quasi-experimental and non-experimental. What exactly is a survey? We all sort of think we know what it is, but what is it really? And where have they come from? How long have they been around for? Some examples and characteristics of survey research, and some types and purposes of survey research. Pros and cons, and then we'll wrap up. And next week we get into the nitty-gritty of how you make a survey. So as I said earlier, this set of readings is actually for this lecture and the next lecture. I've pointed to these online. The Creative Research Systems Steps in a Survey Project. Simple, general, useful reading. The Fowler reading gets more into the nitty-gritty of good questions, bad questions, etc. And from the Fowler textbook, there is a little bit of information in chapter 34 in particular about analysing survey data. NADI's a bit like the Fowler reading on how to develop a questionnaire, and Trochem has some general information about survey research. So they're just screenshots of each of the readings. we don't need to dwell on. Okay, so where are we in the kind of universe of human endeavour when we're using surveys? Well, first of all, we're taking a scientific approach. I guess that's what psychology has emphasised to distinguish itself historically from quasi-psychologies or parapsychologies, to gain respect and to improve its methodologies. Psychology made the decision that it was going to be a science, which meant that it was going to have theories, hypotheses, collect observable data, subject that data to objective, verifiable kinds of analyses, and draw conclusions that could be critiqued and replicated. Broadly speaking, that's what we might refer to as positivism, which is the belief that truth is measurable and analysable. Or if you like, the psychology or data of experience, we can actually collect valid data about that. And not everybody agrees with that, and there are some frustrations and limitations with psychology. Many of you might experience that. There are things in your life, or you see in other people's lives, that when you look through that first year psychology textbook, doesn't seem to be there. If it's spiritual experiences, metaphysical beliefs, all of those things, if they're things that we can't actually see, observe, or extract in a data format, psychology tends to say, well, it's not really worth our attention. And we're not going to dwell on that in this unit, but it's important that if you do a unit on, say, philosophy of science, that's a good part of what you would be debating. But we are making a decision to enter the universe of things that can be seen and measured and therefore analysed using statistics. And you may or may not have seen this quote that actually is attributed to Einstein, that not everything that counts can be counted, and not everything that can be counted actually counts. And psychology is, in some ways, subject to this. We can survey anything and everything, but whether it actually really matters to human lives is another matter. So what we want to be trying to concentrate on is counting, analysing things that actually matter in real people's lives. So what we're saying is we're making an assumption then that the world is made up of psychological phenomena that have properties that can be measured, recorded, and analysed, and that can lead us to make valid interpretations and conclusions about how people think, feel, and behave. So it's a technique to try and extract truth. An imperfect technique, so we're going to get some truth and we're going to get some error, and part of the challenge is working out what's truth and what's error. So how do we do that in science? Well, there's a pretty well-known methodology in general terms. And it looks something like this, that we observe something going on, and whether this is physics or chemistry or psychology, this is a very basic approach. We ask questions about why we're observing that phenomena, and we make hypotheses based on some sort of theory that X is connected to Y. And then we test out those ideas by designing an experiment that will manipulate X or measure X and measure Y as X varies, collect that data, analyse it, and see what it tells us about our original ideas. Modify our theory if it's not right, or if it does seem to be supported, then design something else to test the theory in another way. Now you'll see different versions of that model, perhaps expressed like this as an hourglass, where you start broad, narrow down to a specific question, operationalise, which is to make measurable, such as by using a survey. And this is where surveys come in, because in chemistry or physics, we can just use a ruler in physics to measure how long something is. But there's no personality ruler to measure somebody's personality. A personality questionnaire is the ruler, if you like. It's the measurement tool for assessing somebody's personality or how stressed they are, etc. So we design a measurement tool. We use it to collect data, and then we can do our statistics and report writing. Okay, so we're using science to conduct research, to test ideas. Broadly speaking, there are three main types of research methods, which I'm guessing Janie probably pointed out to you in second year. Experimental research, quasi-experimental research, and non-experimental research. Now, we can use surveys in each of those types of research, but they're very heavily used, particularly in non-experimental research, because there's no real experiment. It's often pretty much survey-based data that's collected. So this is my first kind of hint or tip to say very likely quiz questions attached to types of research, and what are the requirements for an experimental, quasi-experimental and non-experimental study. So the key for experimental it's basically what it sounds like. It is experimental, which means that usually, or there has to be, different groups where something happens to one group and something different happens to the other group. Not only that, the groups have to be equivalent or equal. And the way to get equal or equivalent groups is to randomly assign people to the group. So if a participant walks through the door, basically you toss a coin and go, you're in that room. Next one walks through the door, toss a coin, you're in that room. And that way you should get, if you get 100 people in the door, you'll get roughly 50 in each room. And then in one room, it's painted red, and the other room's painted blue. You're going to give them a survey about how they feel today. You've controlled all extraneous variables. The only thing that was different was that one room was painted red and one room was painted blue, and therefore if there's differences in mood that are reported, we can be confident that we can attribute the cause of those differences to the colour of the room, assuming we had a large enough sample, and therefore the likelihood of all people who love red ending up in one room was very, very low. So the key is random assignment, which gives you control over all other possible explanatory variables, and you're just manipulating one key variable. Advantages: it's seen as the gold standard or the most powerful method. If we're talking about medicine and they want to bring out a new drug and release it for human consumption, there has to be a human clinical trial, which is an experimental trial, where half of the cancer patients got the new drug and half of them didn't, and we've got strong evidence that the half with the drug actually did better. The downs, you might go, well, if it's so fantastic, why isn't everything experimental research? Well, there are downsides. It's very costly and difficult to conduct, so it takes more time, more effort, and depending on what you want to study, it may not even be ethical to do it to people. Even in medicine, if they, in those early stages of that clinical trial, if there's evidence that people are doing better on the new drug, they have to stop the trial because they now ethically know that they're depriving other people of a good treatment. If you want to study head injuries, you're not going to run around out there and give people head injuries. All right? You're going to have to find some people with head injuries, and you're going to have to find some other people like those people without head injuries, and then study the two groups. And that would be, as we'll come to, that's a quasi-experimental study where you find naturally occurring groups. You don't randomly allocate people to groups. And the other limitation is that an experiment might not be what we call ecologically valid, which means that it might not apply in the real world because we get people into artificial environments. In order to control everything, we don't want them sitting in their own homes because their homes are different to each other. We get them into some controlled space. But people behave differently when they know they're being watched or when they're put into artificial settings. So in some cases, we might actually want to go and research people in their natural habitat and get more ecologically valid data from them. So if you'd like to do experimental, but because of costs, because of ethics, because you want to be in naturally occurring environments, perhaps you would do quasi-experimental. And this is where, as the researcher, you go out into the big wide world and you go and find the groups of people that you want to compare. So perhaps it's a group of people with an injury or disease, and you'll get a similar group of people without that injury or disease. So we have groups, we're comparing groups, but there hasn't been, the key is, no random assignment to groups. They already got themselves somehow into those separate groups. We might be able to get some control over extraneous or other variables, so we might match on certain variables like age. If I've got a 25-year-old who rides a motorbike and has got a head injury, I go and find another 25-year-old who rides a motorbike without a head injury. That's matching. You match on key characteristics. So to some extent, you can minimise the differences between those groups. So quasi-experimental offers a balance between getting experiment-like control with some practicalities. It's cheaper to do, it's easier to do, it has less ethical concerns, but the group comparisons are not as powerful or strong because there may be uncontrolled factors. So ecological validity, but less control. Whoops, what happened to non-experimental? Okay, I'm not sure I thought there was a non-experimental slide. So non-experimental, one group. Okay, just one big group of people. We don't do anything to them other than collect data, so we don't manipulate them. And the research question we have is often more just descriptive. We want to know what is the Australian community's attitude towards refugees coming into Australia. So there's no comparisons, it's just descriptive information. And we can do a telephone poll, we can do a web poll. Polls are non-experimental studies. So advantages, quick and easy to do, relatively cheap, relatively quick to do, gives us descriptive information, maybe also correlational information, because you can say, okay, I collected all this data, are males or females more accepting of refugees coming into Australia? So you can get relationships between variables, but you don't have much information about causality. You don't know why these things are related, because you haven't manipulated them in any way. Okay, so you've heard about the 3 types of research. Let's see if we can have a go at these practice quiz questions. What type of research is the following? A researcher surveys Australian community attitudes to eating non-traditional meats such as venison and kangaroo. Experimental, quasi-experimental or non-experimental? Heard a few non-experimentals. There's no groups. Okay, so the key thing is no mention of any groups. We just got one group, the Australian community and their attitudes. Number 2, a researcher compares study habits of university students who regularly use caffeine with the study habits of uni students who do not regularly use caffeine. Fantastic. I heard lots of quasis. Why? We're comparing 2 groups, but we're just getting those people who already have a coffee or a caffeine habit versus those who don't. We haven't said random allocation, you use coffee and you use something else. Number 3, a researcher randomly allocates participants to a morning or evening exercise routine and then compares the sleep patterns of the 2 groups. Experimental, because the magic word random has appeared there. Okay, sounds to me like you've got the idea. What that also means is make sure in your lab report, when you're writing about your study, have you conducted a non-experimental, quasi-experimental or experimental study? So make sure you're using this language in the way you're writing. Okay, what then is a survey? Now I've already dropped some sort of hints. One way of thinking of a survey is that it is a standardised stimulus. Now standardised means it's the same for everyone. There's a reason why you're all using the same survey to collect that data, because it means every participant has been exposed to the same stimulus. Alternatively, I could have said, can you go and talk to people and use an unstructured interview to find out how good their time management skills are? And you would all ask slightly different questions and therefore come back with slightly different answers, but we wouldn't quite know if the answers were different because they were different answers or you asked different questions, and we'd have chaos. So the whole point of doing something standardised is we know, a bit like an experiment, standard conditions, we know that the answers are variable because we've got different people answering, but answering the same questions. You can think of it as a tape measure or a measurement instrument, but for psychological information, we can't see it. If you're going out there and getting height and weight, you'd take a set of scales and you'd take a tape measure. This is the psychological equivalent of a measuring tape. And the other way you could think of it, or I like to think of it, is we're trying to convert fuzzy psychological phenomena into hard data for analysis. And that's kind of tricky to do. How are you feeling today? That's fuzzy. That's very fuzzy information. You might even struggle to put it into language because it's just a somatic, emotional feeling. If we want to analyse those feelings, we've got to convert your fuzzy sense into something made of either language or numbers so that we've got some data to work with. So a survey basically is a translation tool that helps to translate fuzzy stuff into hard stuff. And it does an okay job. Well, if it's a good survey, it does an okay job, but of course it's not going to be perfect. So that's why we want to take a critical approach, and we also want to learn, if you like, the science of how to build a good measurement tool rather than a crappy measurement tool. Now, we kind of take for granted today that surveys are anywhere and everywhere. In fact, I suspect that probably most of us, most days, are asked to fill out a survey in some shape or form. It might be a customer satisfaction survey because you bought a product on the weekend and you've now got an email saying, can you fill out our survey about your customer experience? It might be a political poll with some robot phoning you up and saying, you know, who are you going to vote for in the next election? It might be the biggest survey that we all do is the census. So every 4 years, the government says, essentially, we don't know who's out there and what you're doing, so therefore we need to poll every single household in this country to try and understand the demographic and the profile of the people out there so that we can use that data to guide our policies and our services that we're providing. Because if they don't have that data, how do they know what to do? And in fact, that notion of a census is the origin of survey data. So this photograph is, I believe, from the Netherlands. So the guy on the left is a government official with his pen and his survey, pencil in his survey, and he's visiting a gypsy household, so people living a fairly itinerant lifestyle, asking them a bunch of questions, gathering that data, and taking it back to the government, and then they've got to count on who they've got living in their country and how many people, how old, how much money, etc. So you can see historically that while we still had small towns and you kind of knew everybody because you could, you can know 2, 3, maybe 400 people by name. Once you start getting to the thousands and tens of thousands and hundreds of thousands and millions, how do you provide some sort of central organisation? You need data, and that's really the beginnings of the survey. And interestingly, what was the survey? The last Australian census was last year, and you saw the hoo-ha as we tried to move from paper-based surveys to web-based surveys. And remember, the ABS had their big server crash, and people couldn't submit their forms, and blah blah blah. So the history of this is still, unfolding really in front of our eyes. I dare say in 10, 20 years' time, people will think absolutely nothing of doing an online survey and an online census. But for, 100 years or so, it's been paper-based, and we're now transitioning to an online base. We still go and do paper-based polling for voting, but again, in 10, 20 years' time, I suspect we'll be voting on here, and you don't even have to leave your house. So the early survey research methodology dates to about the 1920s, which is not that long ago. We're talking probably less than 100 years. Prior to that, we didn't really have a lot of demographic information. But it's really since about the 1980s that you could say there's been a kind of solid science around surveys, with books written, theories, principles have been developed so that there's a kind of unified, concrete approach to what is good and poor practice. So today surveys are ubiquitous. They're used widely in many different disciplines. We've mentioned the census to gather demographic information, epidemiology, which is really the demographics of health and disease. There's all sorts of health surveys. So in addition to the census, the Australian Bureau of Stats doesn't do nothing for the other 3 years. They're busy doing all sorts of other more focused surveys on subpopulations, but health is one of the big ones, so that they can plan the health budget and where to distribute the money, etc. In business, surveys are used increasingly, to the point where virtually every serious business now uses some sort of customer satisfaction ratings and pollings, and whether it's going onto Google Maps and rating businesses or TripAdvisors, things like that, or direct customer surveys so that they can try and get some feedback. That's really critical to a lot of businesses. Politics, of course, are using polls all the time. Newspapers are doing political polls to try and gauge attitudes. Psychology, of course, we make extensive use, particularly for measuring attitudes, emotions, are probably the two main topics. And so on. That's certainly not an exhaustive list. It would not surprise me, and I could almost probably guarantee it, that at the end of this year most of you will be psychology graduates. When you go out into a workplace, sooner or later somebody is going to say to you, hey, you just finished your psychology degree and we need a survey, so guess what? Here you go, design our survey for us. It will happen to you at some point. So I would hope that what we learn through this unit is not just abstract things, it's something that you can actually put into practice. So attitudes, opinions, we can measure behaviours through a survey. We do rely on people self-reporting, how often they smoke, how often they recycle, or they're reporting on the behaviours of other people. How often do you see people, being abusive towards others on the sporting field or whatever? We could assess motivations. Why do you want to do something, or to what extent are you motivated by X or Y? Emotions, stress, anxiety, satisfaction, say for customer experiences. And if you do a search of Scopus or Google Scholar and you typed in psychology survey, then these are sort of the kinds of titles of articles that you might see. Environmental attitudes across cultures, effect of working hours on family life, optimism, pessimism as predictors of health, etc. All of those studies, if you drill down into their methods, have used some sort of survey to get their data. Okay, so what does a survey research study kind of look like, smell like, feel like? What are the characteristics? So we've said surveys are widely used in the social sciences. We've said they're standardised, so one of the advantages is you know that each person has received the same stimulus, but also they followed the same procedures. And that's why I've emphasised that the way you collect your data should be done in the way that's described, and if we all followed that, then we could be confident in drawing conclusions around that data because we know how it was collected. There will be some people who don't follow that and do it a different way, and what that will do is add noise into our data set because we didn't know that the procedures weren't followed. The more we can follow a standardised procedure, then the better the quality of our data and our study. By following a standardised procedure, then it also makes the study replicable. So somebody over at ANU could say, hey, let's do the same survey using the same methods, but let's do it at ANU, and now we can compare our results. And because we've used the same methods, we know that the results are directly comparable. I'll go more into this next week, but a survey doesn't have to be purely numerical or quantitative. A survey can ask interview questions, and interviews are a type of survey. So we can also gather open-ended data, word-based data. So they're often quantitative, but they can also be qualitative. The sampling should be impartial, and that's why I've talked about that systematic sampling, not just approaching whoever you want. And surveys allow for ecological validity because we can sample people in their homes, we can sample people on campus. They don't have to come into a university or into a laboratory for us to obtain data. They can be sitting on the bus doing it on their mobile phone. The technology, whether it's paper, telephone, web, means that we can distribute the surveys cheaply, quickly, out into their local context. So I talked about the types of research: experimental, quasi-experimental, non-experimental. We can also look at two broad purposes for survey research. Sometimes surveys, and often, they're just used for gathering information. So into that category I'd put polls, census. They're the two most obvious examples. We don't have a hypothesis. We don't have a theory to test. We just want to know, who do you want to run the country? And who are you, and where do you live? And then we've got theory testing and building. And this is more like science, research, where we've got some ideas that we want to test out. So surveys can be used for both, but really it's only the second category that is scientific and research-based. So information gathering, polls, census, customer satisfaction, even attitudes. If we're not testing a hypothesis, we're really just gathering information. For theory testing and building, we might be using personality theory, social psych theory, etc. Now we can divide those a little bit further. So information gathering can be divided into exploratory, which is very early stage, and we're just trying to scope out a topic or an area and gather some information where there's a lack of any data at all. Descriptive is where we're a bit more systematic. We want to know how old people are, what their attitude is, or we want some systematic, but still just information, descriptive data. When we divide theory testing and building, we can divide it into explanatory research, which is often correlational. Does this X explain Y? Are they related? And really the ultimate outcome, if you like, of good science and good theory is not just can we explain things, but can we predict things into the future. So that's even stronger than explanatory for, say, preventative health, by getting some information about your health now, whether it's through body scans or lifestyle surveys. We can predict your likelihood of getting certain kinds of diseases, and then we can put mechanisms in place to prevent those. That ultimately is where most science is probably trying to get to. Now there are some quiz questions then on these four purposes, and you'll get some scenarios and be asked what is the most likely purpose. So for exploratory, very early stages usually, the goal's to discover and explore kind of newish or unknown psychological phenomena. For example, let's say there's been a natural disaster and we want to know what are maybe we're going in a month afterwards after a tsunami, what are the psychological issues being experienced by the survivors of that particular natural disaster. Entirely exploratory. We've got no hypotheses. We're not even up to the descriptive stage because we probably can't get to everyone. We're just going to ask enough people to get enough of an idea that, hey, there are some big problems or there's these particular types of problems, and then we can decide what we're going to do next. If we go to descriptive, remember we're trying to be a bit more comprehensive now, but no hypotheses. So the goal is just to come up with a reasonably comprehensive description of a phenomena. So you're a business, you've got a certain product you want to market, and you want to profile the people who are buying that product. So you want to know how old they are, what's their gender, where do they live, what kind of work do they do, so that you can build up a good profile on who's consuming your product. Maybe you're in human resources, you want to know what are the working conditions of people in a certain profession, how many hours, what are they getting paid. Okay, so the outcome here is we want a comprehensive report that clearly, accurately describes the phenomena of interest. Then we jump to theory testing and building and explanatory survey research. The goal here is to explain phenomena by looking at the relations between or patterns between different variables. So now we've got a hypothesis or a research question. Are extroverts happier than introverts? Don't know. There might be some theory that says yes, there might be some theory that says no. How are we going to find out? We'll do a survey, administer an introversion-extroversion measure, and have a happiness measure, and then look at the relationships. Okay. It might not quite get to explaining why. Eventually it might. There might be a third variable. We might ask some other questions to try and get a bit more insight into why that relationship exists, if it does. And finally, where we're heading towards, hopefully, is being able to make useful and accurate predictions about what's going to happen next. So, does a couple's length of time together prior to having children predict their relationship satisfaction after having children? Maybe couples who spend longer together before they have kids then are happier after they have kids. Maybe they're not. To do a study like this, we need longitudinal data, not just one-off data. So we need to find couples, probably now, measure their satisfaction. When they have kids, go back and measure their satisfaction. So we need to collect data over time to establish those predictive patterns. Okay, so practice quiz question. A researcher goes and lives in a religious commune because he or she wants to learn about the social psychological characteristics of cults. Exploratory, descriptive, explanatory or predictive? Now some of these are fuzzy, and so both answers are reasonable. You're certainly realising that it's early stages. They're only going to live in one religious commune, so it's probably exploratory because they're just going to one place and they want to find out some stuff about cults. Okay, if they were surveying many different cults, or communes, then it would be descriptive. So the answer here is, the best answer is exploratory. Question? Yeah. Yes. Yeah, I think what you're getting at is it's the issue of generalisation. To whom do we want to be able to generalise here? So in this case, the research is only going into one commune, but they're wanting to find out about all cults. So really it's just early stage exploratory stuff. As I said, they would have to survey multiple cults and sample them to get a fully descriptive picture. Yeah. Does that answer your question or not? Not quite. Do you want to have another go or? Okay. Next question. A researcher measures Australian people's attitudes towards asylum seekers to Australia. Yeah, descriptive. So we're targeting all Australian people, or at least wanting to generalise to all Australians. We're finding out about attitudes, but there's no explanatory or predictive goal of the research. A researcher administers a happiness survey and a personality survey to examine the hypothesis that extroverts are happier. Any guesses? Explanatory? Yeah. There's nothing there about trying to predict anything. We're just trying to look at, is there a relationship? Can we explain happiness based on personality? Post-deployment interviews with defence personnel are used to identify risk factors for post-traumatic stress disorder. These risk factors are then monitored in currently deployed personnel. Predictive. So we've tried to find a relationship between those risk factors and PTSD, but then we're actually using them to try and monitor and support and prevent it in currently deployed people. Okay, so a little bit tricky. You need to sort of think a bit about what the purpose is, but you should be able to work your way through those quiz questions, I think. So, getting towards wrapping up here, what are the pros and cons of survey research? What we've said is that it enables us to be probably more ecologically valid because we can get out into the real world with our measurement tools. We can access a wide range of participants. We can access people in rural areas, people in other countries, people stuck at home, people in workplaces. We potentially can get a large amount of data with relatively low cost. One web page doesn't cost us anything, whether 10 people or 1,000 people answer. There's really minimal extra cost once it's all set up. And this may be a more ethical approach than doing things to people experimentally. Disadvantages. We often have a lack of control over who fills it out, how they fill it out, which in research speak we would sometimes call a lack of internal validity. The data we collect can be quite superficial. So we're saying it's great that you're using something standardised, but the flip side of that is there's nothing really customisable. So somebody might have a really interesting story to tell about their life or about their experience, but we've just asked a bunch of pre-canned questions and we don't get to learn that about that extra detail. Although it's relatively cheap to construct and roll out, it can be costly if we want to get representative data, which means really good sampling So the census is a very expensive exercise because they literally go to everyone. They don't want to miss anybody out. Even if we don't want everyone, if we want to be systematic, then it can be costly to get out to everyone. By definition, we're only getting self-report data, which means that if we're looking for data from people who can't read or don't have sufficient awareness or willingness to report on that data, then this might not be the best technique. So if we want to do a survey of the prison population or children or people with intellectual disabilities or refugees, all of those populations, we're going to have to think really carefully about how we survey them, because there might be language reasons or cognitive reasons or motivational reasons why they don't want to give us the data that we're looking for. Or if we want to research people's brainwave patterns, we're not going to get that from a self-report survey because they don't have access to that information. We're going to have to use a different measurement technique. And if we want to ask about controversial stuff, people might not want to report it. And potentially low compliance rates. Think about what's the likelihood of you responding to an email you might have just received during this lecture from a shop that you bought something from saying, what was your customer experience like? Your likelihood of responding? Probably not that high, maybe 5%, something like that. If you go home and you collect the mail and there's a random survey in there saying, hey, can you spare 10 minutes of your time? Or somebody knocking on your door saying, hey, have you got 10 minutes to fill out a survey? You know, mail surveys, 5-10%, knock on the door, maybe 10%. Web-based survey, just depends on how it's deployed. But we're talking pretty low response rates. How many students fill out the interface, unit satisfaction? It's about 30 to 40% of you do it. No faculty gets more than 40%. Okay, so we're looking at the potential for low compliance, which means that we might be getting subpopulations, self-selected populations, which means that we might not be able to generalise the data. Okay, so make sure you know your types of research: experimental, quasi-experimental, non-experimental. The key is groups for quasi-experimental and randomisation to groups for experimental. We can use surveys in all types, but they're especially used in non-experimental. Think of a survey as a measurement tool, a psychological tape measure for the phenomenon that we want, but it means we're going to have to do some good thinking about how to design our measure. Surveys have been around for about 100 years, but survey science, as a good solid science, has only been around since about the 1980s. We can use surveys to gather information or to test and build theory, and make sure you can distinguish between exploratory, descriptive, explanatory and predictive. Know your pros and cons. So pros: ecological validity, cost efficient, can get lots of data; downsides: low compliance and self-report. So next lecture we'll go into how to make a good survey and how to collect data, how to sample and collect data. So check your timetable. Many of you are probably in a week 1 shoot, so make sure you know whether you're 9:30, 12 or 2:30 tomorrow. And if you've got any questions, email me or come and see me. Thank you, everyone.